All right. Sorry about that. Without any more rambling from my end, can you just give us a little bit of your background for people that
Yeah,
aren't familiar with you?
absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a huge fan. So I, kind of like going way back, my history starts, when I was 12, I was diagnosed with a pretty serious eating disorder. I had anorexia. I was about 5 feet tall and a little over 57 pounds. So pretty sick. I was hospitalized for 2 months in inpatient treatment. That time family lived in Dallas, Texas. I was in Wickenburg, Arizona. Came back from that. That was my first actual interaction with a dietitian. And I remember even at the age of 12, just, having such a big disconnect between like what this person was telling me and what actually made sense. Obviously I got a lot better, came home and ended up getting into running, cross country running, and walked on to the University of Arkansas as a long distance runner. I ended up pursuing a degree in dietetics because I'd been so sick. I wanted to help people that, were struggling with eating disorders or had, eating issues. But unfortunately for me, having that history of having an eating disorder, I had low bone density. I also in high school ended up following a vegetarian diet for over a year, got, lost weight, but ended up losing my period, having all kinds of issues. And when I was at the University of Arkansas, I got a really bad stress fracture in the back of my hip. And that, pretty much ended my collegiate running career. But, I continued on. I wanted to become a dietitian, and I was really familiar. I was very sure that, blood sugar stability mattered, keeping your blood sugar stable mattered, but I didn't really understand it. It's not taught to dietitians, like the importance of, for animal protein, the importance of meat. We're certainly taught that plant-based diets are great and that we need all these carbohydrates and these are really important. But as I started practicing in a clinic, and I'm sure, as you've been, Shawn, working in a hospital setting, it's profoundly bad. Like it's really bad, what's going on. We're putting diabetics on these really high carbohydrate diets and dosing them with insulin. We're putting people on heart healthy diets and, restricting fat and meat and salt, but they can get unlimited amounts of carbohydrates. I've now worked in 2 different psychiatric facilities, and the average amount of carbohydrates that we feed patients in psychiatric facilities is between 300 and 350 grams. Average sugar intake is between 38 and 42 teaspoons a day for this patient population. So that's, I had this dilemma. I'm currently writing a book called The Dietitian's Dilemma, because here I am. I've, spent my entire career wanting to help people, and now I'm in the situation where it's not working. We're seeing obesity, we're seeing rates go through the roof, we're seeing diabetes go through the roof. And all of these dietitians that I'm working with are saying, patients need to eat better. They need to eat more grains. They need to eat more fruit. And I just had this huge disconnect, like this isn't working. But it wasn't really until I lost my own health back almost a full year ago. I'm a long distance runner, I've run 12 marathons. My performance fell off a cliff. Like I just couldn't run anymore. I'd go out for a 2-mile run and I was getting cold sweats. At that time, I was eating about 300 grams of carbs a day. And, I actually consulted 2 different sports dietitians, what's going on? What's wrong with me? And they told me to eat more carbs. So I ended up eating more carbohydrates. And I've shared this story before that my come to Jesus moment was kind of, I was waking up in the middle of the night with like muscle pain and muscle spasms. And I woke up and I just couldn't sleep. It was 2 a.m. And so I drove to 7-Eleven and got 20 pounds of ice, put it in the bathtub, sat there with ice. And, here I am, it's 2:30 in the morning. I'm sitting in the bathtub with ice. And my wife came in and was like, maybe we should do something different. And that's when I was like, I'm done running. I'm 37 at that time. I was 36. So I'm too old to run. And I was like, well, if I'm not running, my goodness, why don't I follow a ketogenic diet? Why don't I get rid of these carbs? Because I knew I didn't like how they made me feel, but I was sure like everybody needs carbs, especially an athlete. And so I decided to follow a ketogenic diet. And then I was doing some research and I came across this crazy guy named ShawnBaker that has this all meat diet. And I remember thinking, especially as a dietitian, like, whoa, like I can get behind meat, but are we sure? But I was curious. And this is what I would encourage people to do. And this is what we don't do enough of, right? Is we don't critically think. We'll see something and we'll either say, this is right, and post it on our Instagram, or we'll see something and we'll be like, that's nuts. But I was curious because I was in so much pain. And I said, this makes sense. I know that animal-based nutrition is highly absorbable, and I know my body hurts. So I decided I'm just going to adopt a carnivore diet for, for 30 days and see how it goes. What's the worst thing that could happen? I thought the extra protein would really help my body. And my wife was, especially having a history of an eating disorder, also have a history of severe anxiety, depression. My wife was like, no, I don't want you to do this. This is eating disorder. This is not good. And I was like, just let me try it for, a couple weeks. And after about 3 weeks of doing it, she asked me to come sit down, said, hey, sit down real quick. And she said, I've known you for 11 years. This is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you. And that was kind of like a huge tipping point for me. Like my anxiety disappeared. Like I wasn't doing this for anxiety, but I felt calm. I wasn't hungry anymore. And also, of course, my muscle pain disappeared. But I attributed like, okay, I'm not running. Well, clearly my muscle pain is going to get better. But since then, I've connected with your former host, Zach Bitter. Zach Bitter is my coach. I got this crazy idea. I said, okay, well, what if I want to start running again? And of course, my wife's like, oh, great. You can be a recreational runner. You don't have to do marathons anymore. So, what if I do ultra marathons? What if I try to run longer than a marathon? Poor wife. If anybody's listening and they have an amazing partner, like shout out to our amazing partners. But yeah, so since then, going on a low carb, very high meat diet, I average for about a pound and a half of beef a day. I've run up to 30 miles at a time. I have a race in less than 2 weeks, a 6-hour race. I'm super excited about it. I had several races planned, but everything's been canceled, so this one, fingers crossed, is hopefully not going to get canceled. So my life completely transformed. And so as a dietitian, I left healthcare. I recently left healthcare just because it's so profoundly bad. You go into it thinking maybe I can help it from the inside out, but I'm kind of thinking I want to step back and I want to kind of help it from the outside. So that's kind of a long, the Reader's Digest version of my life and what I'm doing. So yeah.
Yeah, that is a lot of stuff, and thanks for sharing that. I think just a couple comments that I'll make is, you described the kind of the classic female athletes triad with the low weight, the amenorrhea, the stress fractures. I mean, we see this, pretty not commonly, but certainly it's something I was very much aware of as an orthopedic surgeon, and I would see that from time to time. Almost not always exclusively, but pretty common for women, more so than men for sure. Well, certainly the menstruation part, the men don't seem to have issues with that. But I mean, as far as the low mass and the undereating and the stress fractures that go with that. And then I think it's really, I think when and this is what happened to me too. I mean, I was in this world of doing a lot of surgeries, just cranking patients through, fixing their knees, replacing their shoulders, fixing their broken hips, replacing their hips, whatever, doing sports medicine stuff, doing the trauma, and just grinding in the system. And, you just kind of get in there and you just kind of, this is what it is. And, I guess as a dietitian, all these patients, they're not very compliant. They don't want to they don't want to shut up and eat their quinoa and spinach all the time. They keep sneaking the cookies and the ice cream. What the hell's wrong with these people? It must be their fault, it's frustrating. And, you're just going to continue plugging, you kind of blame the patient a little bit. Surely the paradigm is not wrong. But then for most people, I would say with rare exception, have I seen a medical provider, dietitian, physical therapist, whatever person change their viewpoint and why they do that, unless they've had a personal experience. And I think it's, unfortunately, that's what it takes. And I don't know how many people it'll take to sort of do that, because, I'm sure if you would have been plugging along healthy and didn't have any of the issues you had, you'd still be chugging the carbs and running around and doing fine. And there are some people that do that, but I mean, I think there are particularly disturbing as this senior retirement, these sort of nursing facilities where they just load them up on, their protein source is stuff like Ensure, which is, it's like corn oil or corn syrup, milk solids, and soybean oil.
Yeah,
Ridiculous.
absolutely.
I mean, it's just crazy that they do that. So when So I guess at what point did you make you made the transition over to this low carb intervention style? And then how long did you stay working as an active dietitian before you, because you're an RD, correct? That's you're
Yeah,
registered
I mean, I'm
dietitian.
going to keep I'm still an
Yeah,
RDLD. I
right,
still am a
right.
registered and licensed dietitian, and I'll certainly, continue with that credential. Yeah, I mean, real quick, you made a great point about we just get so used to kind of like seeing this that it's almost becomes like, well, this is just how it is versus challenging, like, well, why is it this how it is? And also in the acute care setting, like our only goal as dietitians is just, are you eating enough protein and calories? It doesn't matter if it comes from Ensure, which is sugar water. I just posted on my Instagram the most common 2 feeding formula, the ingredients, and it's corn syrup, maltodextrin, and soy protein, followed by canola oil. Yeah, it's pretty bad. But so let's see. I transitioned to a carnivore. I started carnivore and then more into a low carb diet in November of 2019. So we're coming up on almost a year. And I was working in a hospital in Portland and was curious because I was a supplemental dietitian. So I had no guaranteed hours, but I was getting 40 hours a week. There was a position opening to move into a full-time position in April of 2020. So guess what happened though in March of 2020, all of a sudden we had, a global pandemic, and I lost all my guaranteed hours. And so I was put into, okay, well, Michelle, we still want you to work. They put me into a call center where I actually took the orders, patients can call in and order food. And so I basically went from practicing as a dietitian to being a call center employee. So I got to take orders from diabetics, ordering chocolate cake and pudding and all this stuff. And it was pretty heartbreaking. So I stuck it out for a while and started to kind of plan, okay, like this isn't working. This is starting to hurt my soul. But I didn't have 40 hours of work anymore. And so that was another opportunity where I was like, okay, I've always wanted to write a book. That's where I started really writing a book. And I have a whole chapter on sarcopenia. Like you said, it's like what we're seeing. We're actually seeing in the hospital setting, I've seen more elderly people that have sarcopenic obesity, meaning they're obese, but they're so under muscled. Like they actually, they can't stand up to go use the restroom. Like they have to have help. This is what we're seeing. And mostly just from under protein, over carbed, over sugared. But yeah, I left officially in August. In August, I put in my 2 weeks notice. I actually took a job in the meat industry. There's a local company in Portland called Scratch Meats. They needed someone to come help break down animals. And sign me up. And the second they said, hey, we'll take you, I put in my 2 weeks notice. I couldn't wait to leave. And, people have asked me like, do you miss it? Do you miss anything about healthcare? And my first reaction was no way. And then I thought about the paycheck. I do miss that. I took a large pay cut to get out of healthcare, but I'm not looking back. I'm happier than I've ever been. And just like anyone, I'm sure, who's listening to this is kind of taken a leap of faith to chase something that you believe in. Like, yeah, you figure it out,
Yeah, that's kind of similar to me. The only part of healthcare I miss was interacting with the people, on a face-to-face basis. I love hearing, just being able to shake someone's hand and and obviously in this age of pandemic precautions, that's hard to do. And then we kind of do this stuff through, virtual stuff like we're doing now. And, obviously for an orthopedic surgeon, there's a huge pay cut. Stop doing that. For people that don't know, orthopedic surgery is the most well-compensated physician specialty in all of medicine. It's very competitive to get into. So I left that for this. And I think I made a good trade, quite honestly, because I'm far more happier this way. And, I think that point about sarcopenic obesity is something that is really, really important, because we do, we look at obesity generally. Most people say, yes, there's some sort of pathology associated with that. I know there's people that are healthy at any size type of proponents, but I think for the most part, obesity is an issue. But when you couple that with sarcopenia, because some of the more healthy, quote unquote, healthy obese tend to still have a fair bit of muscle mass on them. And that has been shown to be protective in a number of different ways, whether it's cardiovascular disease, protection from metabolic disease, having that muscle. And then when you go from, sarcopenia is bad enough, but if you're sarcopenic with, inadequate muscle reserve to function, and then you have all this extra obese inflammatory tissue around you, that's a double whammy. And so we're starting to see that, which is it's almost an impossibility. It's almost like you have to try to make that happen to your body. And the problem is that the food system has gotten so bad that, it's becoming more and more of a reality.
Yeah, well, our recommendations for the elderly are terrible. The RDA for protein, they were designed for 18-year-olds, very healthy people. Like, we know that as you get older, your body doesn't utilize and synthesize protein as well, right? So that means, in my view, we should bump up the requirement just with that, but we don't. And then we have this whole movement that says, oh, meat is bad for you. You need to eat less meat. So I have so many elderly people when I worked in the hospital that are like, oh, well, instead of, and here's the thing too, people aren't saying, okay, instead of beef or turkey or chicken, I'm going to eat tofu or these other proteins, which I don't even think is great to begin with. But instead of that, I'm going to have an extra roll. I'm going to have an extra cookie. I'm going to have an extra, all these sugary things. Like, if you go into, most of the elderly people are eating lots of carbohydrates. They're eating, bread, and they'll have fruit, and they might have a tiny, tiny bit of meat. Where in reality, what they really need is they need a large portion of meat. And I think most elderly, if we said look, you need this, they want to have this. Most people tell me oh, I avoid red meat, or I don't eat red meat. They've just associated it with being something bad. But in turn, they're eating all these, desserts and carbohydrates. And that is really causing this sarcopenic obesity, right? Because they don't have enough protein stores. Then they're gaining weight from the carbohydrates. And it's a cycle. What happens when you gain weight? Well, when you gain weight, you tend to be less mobile. When you're less mobile, you tend to, you're going to have more fat stores. And it's just this really terrible cycle. And then if you're not strong, gosh, you have to be strong when you're older. If you're not strong, what if you fall? We know if you fall and you fracture a hip, the risk of mortality goes through the roof. So many things, that can be alleviated with adequate animal protein.
Yeah, and so I assume even though you're not actively practicing, you probably still have a network of RDs that maybe you still interact with, that some that probably disagree with you, or has there been any kind of pushback from what you've been doing from other RDs?
I would say a lot of, RDs disagree with me. I know it's probably not shocking to anybody watching this that I'm not super popular. The Academy of Nutrition, which it's the governing board of dietitians. It used to be called the American Association of, what was it? The Academy, American Dietetics Association. When I was a young dietitian, when I first started practicing, our number one sponsors were Coca-Cola, Hershey's, and PepsiCo. And I immediately was like, this is weird. This is a conflict of interest, right? And I've had so many dietitians tell me look, Michelle, it's all about moderation. It's all about people like carbs and they like sugar. You're going to upset them. You're going to make them mad, or people will be like, well, not everybody has, not everyone's lean like you, type of thing. And, I can address both those points. One, we know that the human body just doesn't regulate carbohydrates very well. We have great feedback mechanisms, right, for protein and fat. There's the protein leverage theory. We get enough protein, our body will tell us to stop. You're significantly larger human than I am, right? But, if we both start eating steak, at some point, our body will say we're done. But how many people, if you're watching this, or people have plowed through a whole bag of chips, a whole thing of, ice cream, the body just doesn't do a good job of regulating carbohydrates, and neither does the brain. And that's a whole nother topic we could talk about, great work from Chris Palmer and Georgia Ede that are telling us that these things are not great for us. So I've tried to have really intelligent conversations with dietitians I work with, but they seem very, very indoctrinated with their beliefs. We certainly know nutrition beliefs are difficult to challenge. So I've often, probably at least once a month, I have someone threatening to report me for, and I always there's plenty of clinical trials to back up what I'm saying. I would much rather continue to advocate what I know is going to help people and is going to move, hopefully, this movement forward. But yeah, to answer your question, a lot of dietitians disagree with me. But, it's really interesting on Instagram. I've had some people reach out. It's so encouraging that are like, I hear you. I'm frustrated too. And I'm like, oh my gosh, other renegade dietitians, let's do this because you can't, that's the definition of insanity. We can't keep doing these same recommendations. I ran early this morning before I came on this podcast, but before I run, I usually like flip on, my phone, like what's new. There was an article from a dietitian advocating we eat less meat and more grains. I'm like, we've been doing this for 40 years. This isn't working. This isn't human physiology. So yeah, I think we need to stop and we need to ask ourselves, like, what is going to change? What do we know? What do we know when it comes to blood sugar stability? But there's also a lot of fear. I think the biggest thing holding people back is just the fear that animal products and saturated fat lead to heart disease. That's probably one of the biggest things. And so I think continuing to address that and to continuing to address like why that's false and kind of break it down is really important.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. I mean, I think that the point you made is, yep. I mean, people do like eating their breads and their pastries and their cookies and their ice creams. And I mean, to be honest, I liked it too. I mean, I'm not going to sit there and say I didn't like this stuff, and it doesn't, and I still would enjoy eating it, the taste of it, but then I would feel sick and feel not very good shortly afterwards. So that's the point you just kind of trade off on there. So I think that is a hard, I think many people are kind of like, well, I'm just going to give up and just kind of, I think a lot of people in medicine do that. They kind of sit there and they say, well, I tried for a couple of years and I can't get anybody to change their habits. So therefore screw it. We see that with some endocrinologists, we see like diet. Well, yeah, just eat what you want. Just take a bunch of insulin, eat cover with insulin and you're good. I mean, that becomes the attitude because they just see, well, you're not going to change anyway. And it's frustrating as a healthcare provider that you do that. But then once you kind of find that, wait a minute, there's something a little different there because correct me if you're wrong, but I think with nutrition in general, you're trying to constantly construct a diet based upon an assumption that we're supposed to be eating all this basically not human appropriate food. Like I said, grain and all these other things, which humans have been arguably eating for 10,000 years, but it doesn't change the fact that we probably aren't designed to eat them. We can look at a house cat. All of us would concede that a house cat is a obligate carnivore. And yet their eating diets are 60% grain based. When you look at the kibble, I mean, they can tolerate up to 60% grain. Doesn't mean that's what's optimal for them. And I use the same analogy for humans. I'm not saying humans are obligate carnivores because obviously there's people that survive without meat and don't die. But what I'm saying is, you can have a human that's capable of digesting grains to some degree and surviving and deriving nutrition. That's one of the great things about humans, why we're so hardy, I guess. But is that what we're optimally suited for? And I would argue that we're probably more suited for a more carnivorous based diet, whether it's strictly 100% for some people or mostly, which many people end up doing. And they find that they just, the nutrition is so much more available and better, and you feel better when you do that. So, I think those things are very, very interesting points about the cats. So I did early on. I've read so much and done so much research on this stuff. Most of it I've never talked about, but you start looking into cat physiology and dolphin and other obligate carnivore physiology, and you see that they actually have capabilities to upregulate enzymes if stressed to break down certain other foods. And that's what we get with, well, humans have been eating breads and grains forever, and you're like, well, that's because we kind of ran out of food. We really did. I mean, animal food became so scarce. It's only in the last 50 years that we've, through the sort of development of modern agricultural techniques, that we've been able to mass scale meat production, which some people find, problematic. And there are some problems with that. But I think that's the, I think we compare our carnivore diet in this population, we're probably in line with what people were doing 50, 100,000 years ago. And then we went through this period of, there's no food left. And so now we're kind of making by, and some people adapt better than others. So let's talk about, the running, are you finding, so how's the running performance? You said you were just breaking down, miserable, hit stress fracture. when you're on the I think you said vegetarian. I can't remember if you said vegan or vegetarian.
Yeah.
How's the
I
running
was a
going?
vegetarian in high school, and I ended up in college, like, after I no longer was running for the University of Arkansas, I just kind of followed the standard American diet, and it was okay. Yeah, I did okay. I think I did pretty average, maybe a bit above average for a runner. I qualified for Boston 12 times, but I really wanted to qualify for the Olympic trials. And I never quite could get there. And then when I transitioned, and obviously I'm doing ultra running, so I'm doing like longer stuff, not as fast of a pace. I was floored by how much better I felt, because I always thought, like, you have to have all these carbohydrates to run. Like, I got to the point where I couldn't run 5 miles. I was just getting cold sweats, and I was just, I was feeling terrible with all the carbohydrates I was eating. So when I backed up, and for probably at least 3 months, my carbohydrate intake a day was between, 25, maybe 50 at like a max. It was amazing. Like, my recovery went through the roof. I was doing the opposite of everything I'd ever been taught. I've been taught you need to have carbohydrates before. As soon as you're done, you need to have those carbohydrate drinks. But I was running, fasted, or I'd have just some like butter in my coffee. And then when I get back, I'd have some, I'd have beef. It was really strange. When I still worked in the hospital, there I am, all the dietitians have got like their oatmeal and their bagels, and I'm here with this big thing of ground beef. And, I remember they were like, oh, that's different. But I couldn't believe how much better I felt the next day. And I'll give you 2 examples. Like, the last 2 weeks, I'm in my final stage for my ultra run. And like 2 weeks ago, I did a 4-hour run, so a little over 28 miles one day. And the next day I came back and did 16 miles up tempo. So I ran a little more than a marathon, and then 16 miles the next day. That never happened in my low carb or my high carb days. Like, I was so sore, I couldn't walk, but I think what has happened is my body is so efficient at burning fat for fuel now. I'm burning, this fat, and I have so much protein coming in. And there's also another key thing. I think a lot of, I'm sure men as well, but I know a lot of women runners that I've talked to over the years really struggle with anemia. In 2011, I was diagnosed with severe anemia. And even at that time, I was eating meat. I ate meat 2 or 3 times a week. But what else was I doing? I was eating oats. I was eating potato. I was eating a lot of phytates, a lot of things that bind to iron. And so, I got so severely anemic, I had to have iron IVs. And that was great. My iron went way back up, but because I was eating the same diet, it went back down. So now in my life, I'm eating so much, meat, I eat some liver, I eat some other things, and I eat minimal carbohydrates. So I don't have all those things binding to it. I feel like my body can really benefit from getting all those, all those carbohydrates and all that saturated fat. So yeah, but if you had told me last year at this time, like, hey, you know what, you're going to switch to a high protein, high fat, mostly meat diet, and you're going to be running, earlier this week too, I did a 22 one day, 23 the next day mile run. I would have told you you're nuts. Like, you just can't do that. You can't run without all those carbs. But yeah, I've kind of, I've shown myself, through your advocacy and working with Zach, that not only is it possible, like, I feel better than I ever have before, and really quickly going back to the hospital setting, like, it would be my goal and it would be my hope. I never want to go in and tell somebody, like, this is what you should do. You have to follow a low carb diet. Try this carnivore diet. I want it to be an option. I do not understand why we don't, I had a woman who'd been diabetic for 20 years, was about to have her leg amputated. And I was talking with her spouse about a low carbohydrate diet. And he was like, no one's ever talked to us about this. It's like, 20 years? You're about to have your leg hacked off and no one said, hey, how about we try this? So I just want it to be brought up, because people, you're an adult, you get to make your own decisions. If you want to eat carbohydrates and we'll dose you with insulin and you're going to have a terrible quality of life, that's your prerogative. But what if we said, like, hey, there's another way? Why don't we look into this, And let's talk about all these myths. Oh, meat's so expensive. Oh, blah, blah, blah. What's really expensive? And you can advocate this, is a surgery, is a night in the ICU. There's a lot, one night in the ICU is 10 grand. Obviously you might have insurance to cover some of that, but that's a lot of ground beef.
Yeah, that's the thing about costs, and it goes to anything. We only look at the direct cost right in front of us, and we don't consider the overall impact on big picture type stuff. Someone was asking, Stephen, if any of your friends or dietitians have noticed a difference in you, and have any of them sort of maybe moderated their position a little bit, from based on what you've done?
My wife has. my wife now is a carnivore, full carnivore, and I'm not a full carnivore. I do take in some carbs. Dietitians, I don't think any of my friend dietitians have. Honestly, most dietitians are really odd. I only have one really good dietitian friend, one of my really good buddies. But I would say a lot of people who know me, who were just the same thing, like, look, I don't like this, I don't know about this, have really moderated and been like, hey, look, once again, maybe they don't fully understand it yet, but they're like, I can see a difference in you. I can tell, your attitude is better, your outlook is better. My whole life is changed. I'm a better, and I've said this before on other podcasts, like I'm a better everything. I'm a better employee, I'm a better athlete, I'm a better wife. My whole life changed. So I think and that's another thing. Like, you can tell somebody all day about how great a carnivore diet is or whatever, but it's not really until you experience it that you start that you're going to fully embrace it and believe it. So
I see a lot of, as this carnivore diet becomes more and more popular, it's continually dismissed as a fad diet, like eating meat is somehow a fad. It's kind of like, oh, it's, there have been societies that have been basically carnivorous for thousands of years. I think the anthropologic evidence is pretty compelling that we at the very least ate a high meat diet for a large portion of our human evolution, and certainly in certain parts of the world. So I don't think it's that much of a fad diet. And I don't think there's any reason to be dogmatic about it, that's saying, oh my God, that one little piece of garlic is evil and poison. I think that's silly. But yeah. I think that, the fact about people eating meat heavy diets, like real meat heavy diets, not the standard American meat heavy diet, which is 2.4 ounces of red meat a day, which is, they sort of conveniently ignore the 70% of our diet that comes from basically refined grains and sugars and seed oils, calorically. And then they say, oh, it's that 2 ounces of red meat you're eating that's killing you, which just blows my mind. But let's talk about, so as this diet gets more and more popular, as more and more people take it up, as more and more people get success, and some people don't. There's some people that, like any different thing, they just, it doesn't work for them, whatever, and that's fine. But as it grows and becomes more and more popular, and I see it I literally see it every day. Hey doc, I just lost 50 pounds in the diet. I got off all my meds. My anxiety's best it's ever been in my life. I'm no longer on antidepressants. I'm no longer on my high blood pressure meds, my diabetes meds, my, you name it, my anti-inflammatory meds, my immune modulating meds for my autoimmune disease, so on and so forth. As we see that every day, we see a lot of pushback, and we see it's almost as if the RD community is being utilized. And when you talk about the initial people that sponsored the American Academy of Dietetics, or ADA or whatever it was called, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Hershey's chocolate, whatever. It's a little bit sort of interesting to see, but you see these articles coming out saying, no, if you're going on a low carb diet, one, you can't sustain it, because if you dare to eat more fat than we tell you, because then you become satiated and you don't want the carbs. But if you dare to do that, you're going to become insulin resistant, and you're going to die, and you're going to have heart disease. And the other thing is your thyroid is going to shut down, or you're going to be overrun with cortisol. I see this being pushed quite a bit by the people that say you have to have sugar in the diet to avoid these things. And I just don't really see that being an issue for the most part for most people, with regards to hypercortisolemia and those types of things. We have to realize that, a lot of the physiology is based on the fact that if your blood glucose drops low enough, your cortisol will kick in. But that's typically, we have glucagon that steps in long before that happens. It's only when we get critically hypoglycemic that cortisol gets upregulated. Outside of an acute shift to a new diet or stress, anything stressful is going to acutely raise your cortisol for a period of time, and then that seems to normalize. But anyway, what are your thoughts on thyroid function, high cortisol, unsustainability, insulin resistance due to, eating fat? And that's what we see coming out of the RD community.
That's such an odd one to me too, that insulin resistance term. But I'll start with so there is a really important thing, like when you're following a new way of eating, and I see this happen with women, and I have some women reach out to me that are like, I feel like I'm feeling more fatigued or whatever. You have to eat enough. I think as women, we're kind of conditioned that we need to be eating these small portions and eat this salad and eat, it's more feminine to do this. So it's hard to step out of the box and make sure you're eating enough. And it's almost, when I first transitioned to the carnivore diet, it was almost scary how I was personally a little frightened by how much I was eating. Like, okay, I just ate a pound of ground beef and butter and I'm still hungry. I'm going to keep eating. If you're coming from a place where you've been under eating or you've been vegan for a while or whatever, which is a lot of people I know, a lot of people function on kind of garbage nutrition, a lot of processed foods, like you're going to need a lot of nutrition. So I think that's a big mistake that people make. If you're going to be eating, if you're under eating, your cortisol is going to go up and you're going to have issues. Like your human body cannot withstand, under eating for a prolonged period of time. Also, if you have a ton of other stressful things going on in your life, when I first started working with Zach and I was transitioning to this way of eating, that was not the time we were going to be running, 80 miles a week or super hard workouts, and a lot of people, this is a very stressful time in your life, 2020 is pretty nuts. So there's things outside of nutrition that can certainly affect cortisol. But from what I understand and what I know in the research that I've looked at, as long as you are getting enough, you're getting enough fat, you're getting enough calories. This is also not a diet that, or a way of eating where you want to be eating like chicken breasts all day. This is not the bodybuilding diet. You need to be eating a lot of fat, which is also, we've been taught so much, cut the fat off meat, don't eat this tiny bit of butter, use sparingly, you got to go for it. So in my experience, and I can only speak from my personal experience and the research articles I've done, I've thyroid, I recently had all my labs checked. I'm going to have them checked again after my race, but everything went really well. And from a lot of other women that I've talked to, that have had issues, it's generally because, they were under eating or, perhaps not enough fat. So the unsustainability thing is just garbage. All that is, there's a whole things of research that this has very high compliance. One, because you're not hungry. What's hard to do? I used to stare at the clock like, oh my God, it's 10 and I just ate at 8, but I'm hungry. When you eat those carbohydrates, blood sugar up, down, right? So this is very sustainable. And yes, absolutely. Like if you have been utilizing food as a coping mechanism, which is very common, very, very common, then you're going to have to, I shouldn't say have to. I hate when people say must or have to, but it's probably going to be beneficial to you to develop some healthy coping mechanisms outside of food. But as far as sustainability goes, I've never been so happy to eat. You basically get to eat, and food is delicious. You get to eat high fat, high salt, delicious tasting food. And I think that's why we're seeing people on the carnivore diet, years and years after that, where we often see people on vegan diets that can't sustain it very long just because it isn't, you do have that blood sugar, spikes and crashes, and, you're not getting all those nutrients. And from what I've, talked to several people who are vegan, they get really hungry. I know when I was vegetarian, I was hungry all the time. So yeah, when you're eating, in my experience too, when you're eating enough, getting enough fat, you're going to be just fine. And insulin resistance, so insulin resistance is a disease of carbohydrates, that has, at least in my experience, I've never seen in my 11 years as a dietitian, I've never seen somebody in the hospital setting following a low carb ketogenic or carnivore type diet with diabetes. Never seen it. Ever. And I actually did a poll when I first started this because I was angry. Every dietitian I could talk to. And the only time one person had seen someone in the hospital setting on a ketogenic diet is when they had a bad bike crash, like at all. Like these people, so much of our modern diseases come from carbohydrates, and more specifically processed carbohydrates. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would further caveat, I think one of the qualities about these ultra processed foods, many of them carbohydrate based, is it's just so easy to overeat them. And that's, I think there's a important aspect with that. Do you find that, well, let me ask you about your new job. So you're breaking down meat. What's, how did you, I mean, did you have some background? I mean, what would make you want to do that outside of liking to eat meat? I mean, how did that
No, not a thing.
job?
No, I didn't. So when I started eating, like fully carnivore, it became pretty clear. And, you know, obviously I've been doing research and I'm a big fan of regenerative farming. I have my own YouTube. I've had Will Harris from White Oak Pastures on. It became clear to me that like, this is the kind of agriculture I want to support, right? The people who, even if you're not like certified regenerative, like I want to follow people that are doing the regenerative agriculture. And so there's a farm about like 85 minutes away from where I live that they were doing that. And so I contacted them, hey, I want to get a beef share, you know, got the beef share. And I found out pretty quickly that, you know, you get a lot of different cuts. And some of the cuts were really tough. And so I was like, I don't know what to do with this, you know? And so I got on Amazon, I got a meat grinder. And I can't tell you, like, you know, opening up the meat, cutting it, breaking it down. And they would give us liver too. They'd give us, if you got a share, you get free heart, free liver. And I just felt like really connected to the animal. It kind of felt like it was a powerful experience to be like, I'm utilizing all of the animal. And for someone too, that's had a history of an eating disorder, who's restricted food and who's been afraid of food and who's been afraid of fat. For me, you know, we made our own tallow. We broke down the fat. And it was just a really like, it felt like a pretty healing process. And so, you know, as I was thinking about what I wanted to do next from being a dietitian, I looked into butchery. And I have a friend who works in Portland who owns a butcher shop, but with COVID, wasn't really looking, you know, to hire. And so I was like, well, what can I do? You know, I just kind of kept looking online. Is there something I can get my foot in the door that I can kind of, you know, be a part of a small company? And then when I found, you know, Scratch Meats, which is basically, it's small, it's, you know, it's a local, they source from, we have, I think, 8 different farms, and we break down animals, we make them into sausages, and, you know, we have hearts and other things that they sell. It just seemed like a really good opportunity. Just once again, get my foot in the door. And it's been fantastic. I love every minute of it, you know, and like you said, going from, it's totally different. It's very different than seeing patients, you know, going in and working with meat, but it's been really good.
Yeah, you'd met Sam was asking about, I guess you interviewed someone recently who's a type 1 diabetic, treating it with a carnivore, I guess on a carnivorous diet. And I wanted you to comment on that. I'm not sure. It's Elizabeth Ping, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm not
so we
familiar.
interviewed, and I had another type 1 diabetic, and I'm especially curious in type 1 because my nephew, I've got a nephew who just turned 9, who is a type 1 diabetic. And so she actually, you know, her story, when you became a type 1 diabetic at the age of 29, we're seeing it actually, it used to be, you know, I'm sure, you know, it was called juvenile diabetes was type 1, and then adult onset was type 2. But now, unfortunately, we're seeing so many kiddos. The youngest kid I've seen with type 2 is 8. But anyway, so, you know, she decided that she wanted to follow a low carbohydrate diet just because she was struggling like with the numbers. Like she was, you know, people don't understand, a lot of people don't understand that, you know, especially as a type 1 diabetic, like if you eat, let's say 15 grams of carbohydrates, it's not like a 1-to-1. They usually do them in 15-gram doses, but I might inject myself with, you know, a specific amount of insulin, but it doesn't always correlate. So even if this is supposed to be like level me out, this may take me too low. This may take me too high. I may need more insulin. So she just found she was constantly chasing her blood sugar. And of course, you know, if your blood sugar goes too low, even if you just ate a bunch, you have to eat more to get it back up. So she was kind of constantly chasing her blood sugars. And so she decided, okay, well, I'm going to try, you know, first the keto diet. And then she ended up, for her, she said it was difficult because she was trying to get those specific keto macros. So she did the carnivore diet. And with the carnivore diet, she was able to get rid of all of her fast acting insulin. She still needed to use the long acting insulin, you know, once again, because people with type 1 don't have any, you know, they don't produce any insulin from the pancreas. So for her, you know, she said that when she went to her primary care physician, like he didn't actually believe, like, are we sure you're type 1 diabetic? Because her numbers were so low, like her A1C was so low, her blood glucose was in normal range. And obviously she checks her blood sugar frequently. But yeah, even with the very high protein diet, because, you know, you're going to get gluconeogenesis, so you're going to get some blood sugar raising from that. She finds that she doesn't need any of the short acting insulin, which is, to me, is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and we've got a number of type 1 diabetics in this community. I mean, I can think of 4 or 5 off the top of my head, very easily, that are all seeing very similar findings. I mean, they're minimal amounts of basal and either none or minimal amounts of, the fast acting, Humalog or whatever they might be taking as their corrective dose. And so they see their, it's probably the easiest, in my view, it's probably the best possible diet for any really type 1 or type 2, quite honestly, as far as, you know, controlling blood sugar, because you are right. It's, gluconeogenesis ultimately, well, I guess I would say endogenous glucose production to be more accurate, because there's glycogenolysis occurring, at various phases that's really where we quickly get our sugar from. Our liver just spits out whatever we need from its glycogen reserves. But anyway, it's interesting to see. Have you are you becoming a bit of since you're becoming a butcher, I guess a butcher, a breakdown person, what are you learning about meat that you didn't know you could teach us about? I mean, I've kind of recently started to play with smoking bigger cuts like briskets and stuff like that, which is, as you've got that short end, it's a different art. It's an art all into itself, quite honestly. So what are you learning about the art of butchery, I guess?
It's beautiful. It's really fascinating. Growing up, like, all I ever knew was this ground meat in like a tube, right? And so learning like there's so many different cuts of the animal, and like where is it from, and then potentially what to do with it. How do you actually cook this? And so my job right now too is pretty basic. Like, I hope that, like, kind of the next step that I would take would be a little bit more in depth, and continuing to learn more about like all the different, cuts. And when it comes to my personal, how I eat, I'm relatively, honestly, I'm pretty boring about how I do a lot of either just steaks, ground beef, liver. But for me, probably the biggest thing that I've learned, it just comes back to like honoring the whole animal. There's this really interesting, I got someone, and I know you get this a lot on your social media, that commented on my page that said, yeah, it's a shame that something has to die for you. It was a vegan, and it was like, it's such a silly, something dies for everything, it's obviously, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's made me have a deeper appreciation of the entire animal, because we also, when you break down an animal, you have everything. You have the fat, that you can make into the tallow. You have the different organs. You have the kidneys, and even things that maybe potentially aren't as popular that people may not want to buy, you can take to your animals, or you can use for compost. And so, I don't have a whole lot of feedback on like different cuts that I've learned. I've kind of knew some of the basics, but for me, that it's been more of just being connected and being fully appreciative. Because I feel like that's how it's supposed to be. Shouldn't the goal of our lives to be, my personal philosophy is I have like 2 life goals. Like, I think people should chase their passion, whatever that is. For me, it's distance running, and certainly now it's become, more of advocacy of this way of eating, and then to help others. And shouldn't we be eating in a way that supports this, right? When I'm eating this animal, when I'm putting into my body the things that, align with human physiology, the way humans were supposed to function, my body is functioning optimally, my brain is functioning optimally, I'm going to be the best human I can possibly be. And I wonder if all vegans can say that. I try to be nice. I try not to come back hard at them. Sometimes it got me real hard on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. I tell you, it's something. But yeah, in general, that's probably the biggest thing, is just being grateful for the whole process, because it's really a beautiful process. I really wish that we did more. People are so disconnected from where their food comes from, I think, and we're kind of afraid, like, oh my gosh, there's blood and blah blah blah. But I think more people would embrace it and really be appreciative if they kind of saw the whole process.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, I mean, here's the other thing, and I hear it all the time from dietitians and nutritionists and others that say that, you can't exclude an entire, food class, i.e. carbohydrates, but in the same breath, they'll say, here's how you do a vegan diet. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I don't understand the hypocrisy there. Were you ever in that camp, or can you justify how people can make that those apparently completely, opposite statements that don't exclude an entire class, but go ahead and give up, all animal products.
Sure. Well, here's the thing, and I think it can come. I do think it can come from a good place. And for me, like, let's say, like, when you're in, like, maybe the throes of, like, a really serious eating disorder, like when I was, and you're eating minimal calories, minimal food, the idea of, like, intuitive eating, and you can listen to your body, and we want all foods to fit, and, it can feel very empowering, and it can feel like, oh, I can eat these things that I restricted, and I can eat these things that I was afraid to eat. So I hear that, right? Like, I kind of understand where they're coming from. But then I think you have to come back that, like, one, as you know, as medical professionals, like, the very first thing, it doesn't matter if whatever you're doing in medicine, our number one priority is to do no harm. Like, no matter what you do, we're supposed to, do no harm. Then I think we have to come back, and I think we need to really ask, like, are these things food? Are a lot of the things we're putting in our body food? And you alluded to it a little earlier with the processed carbohydrates. There are people whose full-time jobs, I think this is a fascinating full-time job, food scientists, that their whole job is to find the bliss point of processed foods. What is the bliss point? The bliss point is that point where, when you're eating a food, I'll use example, like coffee creamer, French vanilla coffee creamer. It is somebody's full-time job to find at what point is it perfectly sweet? Meaning that when you drink it, your taste buds are like, oh, this is yummy. This is great. Because if it's too sweet, you're like, ugh. If it's not sweet enough, you're like, meh. But not only to, like, tempt your taste buds, but also to light up certain things in your brain. It is somebody's full-time job to figure out how to make your taste buds love it and override your brain to keep you coming back. So to me, it's like, when you say all foods fit, all processed foods, all cupcakes, all cookies, all whatever, are we sure? When we know that these potentially, are overriding our brains. So I think you're asking, I think people or dietitians who feel that, I think you may be asking the wrong questions, as opposed to saying, well, can all foods fit? I think we need to say, well, are all foods supporting our body and brain? That's it. Like, are all foods supporting our body and brain? Because I think when we come back to it, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I clearly, I have pretty strong feelings about a vegan diet. And I will say, I've heard professionals, several people I respect very much, say that, if you do it correctly, it can be fine and it can work for many people. But once again, I can only share my personal experience. I've never seen people become so sick as when they follow that way of eating. Because once again, we know that nutrition, the human body is a supercomputer. You can't, when you're putting in things that, like, don't, like, think about it like coding, like, your vegan soy and all this kale and stuff, you're putting in the wrong code. And maybe the computer still works, but you're getting all these error messages like, hey, you're getting joint pain, you're losing weight, your hair's falling out. Your brain stops functioning, as well. It doesn't, to me, it's really unfortunate. And to me, it's really unfortunate to say, and it doesn't make sense. It's a little bit of like, okay, well, excluding animal products is totally fine according to the Academy of Nutrition, but eating mostly animal products will kill you. Like, but as you know, once again, it comes back to corporate sponsorship, and it also comes back to, you have to follow the money. I said this on my podcast with Zach, like, if you are well, if you follow a carnivore diet, a low carb diet, a ketogenic diet, and you're well, I've lost you as a customer. Like, I can't kill you. I got to keep you alive, but I can't heal you. And either end, I lose you as a customer. So it's kind of like disease management. We're not in healthcare anymore. We're going to keep you just sick enough. And that's diabetes, feeding people consistent carb diets and dosing it with insulin is like the greatest way to keep someone sick. Like, whoever thought about that, whoever's PR for, all those diabetic companies, that's brilliant work, because it's worked for many years. It's killed a lot of people, but it's made a lot of money. And obviously I'm saying that a bit in jest, but it's, it's really frustrating. But I do think a lot of dietitians, I know they care, and I know they want to do the right thing, but it's like, you can't see the forest through the trees. I shared the last 2 hospitals I worked at, over 60% of the dietitians are obese. So it's like, oh, geez.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of people that don't like this, but I do think there is some degree of hypocrisy when you're telling someone a way to eat and you can't sort of fix your own sort of health position. I think you should be able to at least figure out what works for you, and before you're able to. And it's very controversial. I know there's people who get upset when you say that, but I think there's some degree of you don't go to a dentist whose teeth are all falling out. You don't go to a car mechanic who drives a car that doesn't run, or I mean, it's just So if we're seeing all these dietitians that are obese and at the same time pushing carbohydrates, the other thing is we have this, and I don't want to undermine this at all, the problems with hypoglycemia that can occur, because it can be life-threatening for sure. And so we have this panic belief that we need to eat enough carbs so we don't get hypoglycemic at all times. We need to keep our blood glucose perhaps higher than it needs to be. If you look at the goals from the ADA, I mean, it's I think the range is tops out of 180. That's their they want to keep you up there somewhere in that 120 to 180 range, so you don't get into this dangerous hypoglycemic range. But the interesting thing I've seen is that people on a higher fat diet seem to not have issues with hypoglycemia. I mean, the body just seems to be protecting itself from the clinical symptoms of hypoglycemia. And we've got people here that are both diabetic and non-diabetic that are seeing blood glucoses in the 50s and 60s, and fine. I mean, they're just chilling out. I mean, they're not, whereas before, you'd somebody be shoving a glass of juice in front of them, typically. I mean, that's the sort of mentality that we have. But I think there's this profound fear, and I don't know if it's because of the carbohydrate physiology that drives that, or if it's just a kind of like, let's just keep people eating these really highly profitable, cheap foods that continue to make a lot of money for us.
Yeah, I think, definitely from working in the hospital, people are going to want to run diabetics on the high side. Like, I see that across the board. Like, they'd much rather people's blood sugars be in the 200s versus get too low. And you're right. Like, we're not trying to make light of what can happen with a severe hypoglycemic episode. But I've only seen that when someone was like overdosed with insulin, like was given way too much insulin and didn't eat. I've never seen that in a naturally occurring event. And you're right, when you eat enough fat, fat obviously slows down the release of glucose in the bloodstream, keeps things much more stable. And our body does a really good job of just naturally keeping our blood sugar stable when we don't mess with it. So yeah, I think that's unfortunate, and I think it's if somebody is consistently trying to run somebody's blood sugars in the high range, even like you said, 180 over time is still high. It's still too high. That there's consequences. You're going to get 10, 20 years down the road, you're going to have issues with probably with kidney. We see a lot of diabetics with kidney failure, neuropathy. Man, I had a patient come in that had stepped on a piece of glass 5 days ago and didn't know. Like, they didn't know for 5 days, just because they had no feeling in their foot. And by that time, they had a serious systemic infection in their blood. Diabetes obviously has all kinds of consequences. So I think there's so much fear. There's so much fear around change and around shifting. But I think if you just get back to the very basics, like for me, it kind of took okay, I always encourage people to do this. Take a deep breath, take the emotion out of it. People get very emotional about food. It's a very personal, very internal thing, and say well, what makes sense? People evolved eating meat and fat. We know we can get all of our nutrition that way. We know people did it for millions of years. So it certainly isn't gonna, it's not dangerous. And I mean, you can even look on the flip side. You say, okay, well, I want to follow a vegan diet. Well, we know you're not going to get B12. No B12 in the plant kingdom. People will argue, well, what about algae? Well, there's a clinical trial in my book that when you eat, the statement Diana Rogers had it in her book, The Sacred Cow. Algae, when you take an algae, it actually increases your requirement for real B12. And I also think this is a huge misconception in the nutrition field. We've done a really poor job of teaching people, just because a product has something, like let's say a carrot has, or spinach, let's use spinach. Spinach has 6 milligrams of iron per cup, but your body can't absorb it. Your body, it doesn't help you. It would I use on my Instagram, it'd be like me writing you a check for $1,000, but I have $17 in my bank account. Just because tofu has 10 grams of protein per block, Well, it also has tons of trypsin inhibitors, so trypsin, your body needs trypsin to digest this protein. So if it has that in it, your body can't utilize it. It doesn't help you out if it's in there, but you can't actually utilize it. It doesn't do a good job. That's why you need bioavailability matters. It's very important. And we know when we eat animal products, we have great bioavailability. That's why you see people who eat a lot of animal products. Even my own story. My nails are better. Your teeth are going to be stronger. Your hair is going to be better. Your muscle strength is going to be better. It matters.
Yeah, I think that it matters is a great concept, and clearly, at the end of the day, we're all looking for health and those things, and not, what's on paper versus what's in the mirror are two different things very often. So Michelle, thank you. We've gone through an hour on Sunday morning.
Sure.
I appreciate you taking so much time to be with us. Where do people go to find out about, find more about you, I guess your upcoming book, and how to follow you, and when in your race, when is that going to occur? And do we have a prediction on how far we're going to get in 6 hours?
Oh, Lord have mercy. So, okay. Follow me on Instagram. I'd really appreciate it. So it's all one word: run, eat, meet, repeat. It's kind of like what I do: run, eat, meet, repeat. If you search Michelle Hurn, Hurn, you'll probably find me. The goal to have the book out it was going to be December. It's going to be between December and January. So we'll see. It's a super exciting process, as I'm sure you know with your book. It always takes longer than you think it's gonna. And then my race is November 7th. So as we sit here today, 2 weeks from today, hopefully I'll be sitting here very sore. And so the goal, I've never run more than 30 miles at a time. My goal is to run 42 miles or more. So I believe if I can run 42 miles, I can probably win the race. It'd be kind of cool to win your first ultra. But it's an ultra. So I figure regardless, win, lose or draw, I promise everyone listening, anyone who follows me, that I'll fight to the end. If I have to crawl, I will. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'm just like everybody else. I'm grateful to be a healthier human. And Shawn, thank you so much for your advocacy and everything you do. I'm very, very grateful.
Well, if everybody's putting the message out there, that's great that this gets more people. Like I said, it's how we kind of spread things, because we have a large, well-funded folks that are going to tell you to eat the other way. But anyway, we have to keep doing what we do. All right. Thank you very much, guys. We'll see you guys back tomorrow. You guys have a great rest of your weekend. And Michelle, thank you again. I'm going to go follow you on Instagram. So take care now. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thank you.